Okay. Hello. My name is Kai Reaver. I'm an architect and researcher here in Oslo, Norway. I'm currently working on my PhD at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. I run a small research practice called Udaru, and I'm also a guest professor at the um, Haute École d'Art and Design in Geneva. I'd like to talk today about what I've titled Comparative Studies of the Experience of Architectural Space through Virtual Reality. And since we only have 15 minutes, I'm going to move quite quickly through some of the sort of base topics and arguments. The project is a component of a larger research endeavor called Digital Urban Living. Mostly what we're looking at is the so-called smart city and how it kind of integrates with the Nordic welfare state model. One of the things that perhaps is a component of the Nordic welfare state model is the very high degree of trust between citizens and their government. And we're trying to see how to integrate some of these new technologies and urban services into some of the base values of the welfare state. My particular research topic is looking at these new forms of spatial digital media, which are a component of the smart city. Particularly, I'm looking at things like virtual and augmented reality and some of the positioning technologies such as 5G and what they have to do with things like regulation and the public realm, user privacy, et cetera, but also, let's say, things like spatial practice and ways in which to work with this as designers and planners. I spent about 4 years initially after graduating in a large global architecture practice and while teaching a quite classical form of architectural studio. Around 3, 4 years ago, I started working with technology startups and my own research studios. And about 2 years ago, I started my PhD research. Based on my observations from this experience, I think architectural practice and pedagogy is based on a rather intuitive methodology with a high degree of spatial training, but a low degree of scientific training or empiricism. I think this is because that architecture is primarily marketed as works of art by a master architect. Through my experience, though, I see that projects often require dozens of individuals with different expertise and are very rarely the act of one person alone. My experience with technology practice and research is that we often do find an empirical methodology, but there's also a low degree of spatial training. And I think that's because there's a kind of medium to high degree of scientific training within a lot of the engineering disciplines. I think this is because this is marketed primarily as infrastructure or services behind a big tech brand. But in my experience, a lot of the time, specialist consultancies and startups are involved in the process or even bought out during the process. So some of my questions are, how do we design an empirical architecture practice, but also how do we organize, let's say, spatially oriented technology research? The prevailing theory in my experience in California and Norway mostly is that architectural experience emerges from a physical place as a result of genius loci, or the spirit of place, and that the architect's role is to enhance that spirit. Nordahl Schuss, who wrote Towards a Phenomenology of Architecture, is from Oslo and has formed a lot of the kind of theoretical basis of the kind of Scandinavian late modernism. And so I've been dealing with these forms of theory as the kind of primary way in which to think about architecture and architectural design methodology. However, when I started architecture school, I also began to notice various critiques of genius loci beginning to emerge. This is Pérez Gomez, um, suggesting that we can recognize purely material qualities in a supposedly identifiable place with its particular genius loci is a delusion, he claims. So around 3, 4 years ago, I began to look at what new forms of digital technology could help to understand this question of architectural experience. This is the first course where we were simply looking at this new consumer grade virtual reality headset that we could purchase on the budget of an architectural research studio and merely see how that could influence how students and architects could design and begin to evaluate things through user testing of space. Gradually, we began to see how we could iterate from fully digital sketches to more, let's say, physical prototypes, such as on the left, and then begin to test these things as they became real buildings, if you will. This is a prototype for a bar in London called the Hexagon Bar, and this gentleman is a bartender who's then testing out the space, and we're using that to create a kind of iterative design process for the planning of the bar. And this is Ayaka, who was an architecture student in Bangkok, where I did this research studio. And this space that she has recorded digitally through a technology called photogrammetry was a space that is very special to her because it's where she learned to paint. So this is the painting studio. And this is the first test at really looking at how could we fully copy the sort of essence of an existing space in the real world. And this was also replicated through sound and lighting and bringing a lot of these kind of experiential qualities into the space. My observation from these early studies was that users within virtual reality environments report having experiences which are similar to the deep phenomenological experiences of architectural space in the real world. This seemed strange to me, and I think it provided me with this form of challenge, being that if an architectural space is removed from its physical place and material properties and replicated as a digital replica in a lab, the experience of such a place cannot be bound to its genius loci alone. I've then been spending time also through the generous literature list provided by Anfa, going through what some of the supporting evidence to this type of finding could be. Of course, studies of the hippocampus and grid cells and place cells, some of that research actually done here in Norway has been interesting to follow. And then, of course, there's hundreds of papers on where spatial representations and navigations may be located in various parts of the brain that have begun to produce a lot of supporting evidence. And thank you to all the many people who I've reached out to that have helped to help me find the literature and to go through some of these studies so I can understand it better. I don't have time, of course, to go through all of this, but it has been a really interesting journey, and I'm just kind of barely scratching the surface, I'm sure. Based on this, this is my now working hypothesis. That would be that architectural experience seems to happen in the brain through sensory input data such as vision, movement, and hearing. And so based on that, I've been looking at how to set up experiments to see how I could learn more about these effects. One is the resolution, seeing when replicating physical spaces digitally, how close the resolution can be, and then doing comparative studies of those. The second is then looking at user feedback when designing and how to implement that into policy, practice, and regulation. And the third component is then what is the kind of day-to-day practice of architecture and design in relation to understanding some of this data. I've done a pretty wide range of case studies, but we don't have enough time, so I think I'm just going to present this one, which is maybe the most important one so far. Many of you may recognize this. This is the Nordic Pavilion in Venice, Italy, done by Sverre Fan in 1962. It's widely acknowledged as one of the masterpieces of late Nordic modernism, the sort of phenomenological tradition as well. And so I went here and used this this little guy called a BLK 360, a LiDAR 3D point cloud scanner, to make an entire copy of the building, and then to recreate that data into a 3D point cloud. I also spent quite a bit of time recording the sound in the building. I then took that data and repurposed it into a Unity model, which is a gaming engine. And then through various different forms of user testing and user polling, I've been trying to see how close we can get, and then what they're kind of reporting back on the resolution and the experience of this space is like. So I've had this model for about 2 years now, or a year and a half, and it's started to produce some interesting data. Users report a high correlation, close to 90%, between the experience of the physical and the digital versions of the building, which is a quite interesting find. For example, this is an architect who had visited the physical building before and reported that it was almost exactly like being there, or 99% the same. And particularly that the sound of the birds was very powerful, which I think is interesting, that we don't forget sound and how important that is in our experience of space. Here's a landscape architect who also had visited the physical building before, who said it was very similar and at least 90% similar. This person also wanted to move around more and also reported that they thought they were in Giardini for a moment. So that's also an interesting find. I've also had the pleasure of letting people experience the digital version first and then visiting the physical in Italy and reporting back. This is an architecture student who said that I felt like I had already been there and it was exactly the same, and that the weather was better in the digital version. And now I've been working with a range of artists for the Venice Biennale, the Nordic exhibition in 2022. And we've been using the digital version only in order to plan the exhibition due to coronavirus and travel restrictions. And so some of them are saying how much they love the space digitally and that they hope the real one is the same. So hopefully we'll be getting some interesting data out of that project as well. The second is then looking at things such as urban planning and urban participation and how to use some of these mediums in that form. So this is a technology called augmented reality. Um, and what I've been doing here, this is a case study with youth participants from the inner city of Oslo in Norway. And we've been visiting various building sites around the city, and we've been using this technology to help people sort of self-design their environments. So these are areas in which the city wants to upgrade through primarily vegetation and trees. They want to plant 100,000 new trees. And so then part of the proposal is to be using local inhabitants and youth to help us do that, and to understand how these technologies can help us help people co-create their environments. I think what's interesting about this is by merely providing a sort of library of components, we can merely look at what people prefer by allowing them to design things themselves. So it can get pretty crazy inside of these digital models, but particularly these youth, they're between 14 and 16 years old, seem to really enjoy this form of medium. And then when looking at how to submit something like this to a rural planning proposal, we've been kind of using this digital information and user feedback to help kind of create real planning documents. And these are some of the proposals that they designed, again, by merely kind of offering a library of components that were already pre-approved by the city. We could give inhabitants the ability to kind of self-design. The last part is then integration into, let's say, a day-to-day model for architectural practice. I think one thing that as educators and researchers, something we should commit to is preparing our students for some of the findings that is coming out of the neurosciences based on these various ideas we have about architectural experience and the experience of space. And so I've been attempting to see also how then we can use these digital technologies to help students sort of prepare for a mode of practice that would be relevant in this form of environment. Um, so in this kind of lab setting, one of the things I'm really trying to do is to kind of remove the question of authorship. So I'm attempting to really take a step back and merely provide a kind of setting for these things to be explored and for the relationship between sort of architectural space and spatial experience to be explored through these digital media. Secondly, we're trying to take a step back from merely designing new buildings. We've been concentrating mostly on existing space and existing buildings, and then studying them in different ways. So this is also becoming a new master's course in Geneva called Architectural Heritage and Digital Media. And that's also based on the observation that a lot of great buildings around the world are disappearing, they're being demolished, or climate change is kind of eroding a lot of really important cultural spaces around the world. So I think one of the things we're really attempting to do is understand how do we create an architectural backup, not only through drawings, but through the actual physical spaces as they are experienced, and how do we create a kind of archive of these places, and how do we use that to build a larger and more robust understanding of what these architectural experiences are. So I think that's all we really have time for, but thinking about further studies and where I would like this to go, I've been talking to many of you, and trying to figure out how to develop methods to scan brain activity in both physical and digital spaces and then compare that data. I think that would be really interesting, and that'd also be the kind of natural progression from some of these case studies. So some form of mobile fMRI, I'm not sure. It doesn't seem that the technology exists today to do this, but if anyone has any ideas, please let me know. The second is I'm writing a lot of policy proposals for the integration of this user data into urban planning procedures and as methodology for design practice. So that should have some sort of political impact to help inform how we work and what kind of integration we want between these types of technologies and the way in which government and public services requires them as a component of their kind of democratically mandated procedures. So thanks a lot. Thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch, please send me an email or a message. I hope you have a great conference. And if anybody wants to collaborate or share sketches or wants some help or anything, I'm more than happy to contribute. Thanks again.